Today's daf we're going to be learning is Gittin Daf Mem. Today's daf is sponsored by Rabbi Joel and Shalamith Cohen in loving memory of Rabbi Dr. Akiba Predmetsky on his yurtzeit. Shavua Tov to everyone. We're going to be starting our daf from the bottom of Lamed Tedem of it. We're still continuing with all sorts of issues about Avadim. We're going to have some crossover with some things we saw previously and try to figure out, see there might seem to be some contradiction, and we'll figure out how we connect it. So Amar Rabbi Zera, Amar Rabbi Chanina, Amar Rav Ashi, Amar Rebbe. Okay, this is a long tradition passed down in the name of Rebbe. Eved shenasa et bat chorim b'fnei rabo. We now have an interesting situation. What we're going to have in the beginning of today's daf are all sorts of indications that either the master wants to free the slave or intends to free the slave or already did free the slave. And then the question is, can we assume the slave is freed based on this? So we have someone who nasa'et bat chorim b'fnei rabo. We have an eved marrying a Jewish woman in front of the master. Now, if the assumption is, if the master is letting this happen, it must be an indication, or possibly it's an indication, that the master has already freed the slave. And therefore, Rebbe says, Yatsa l'cherut. This slave is a free person. Because if he wasn't free, how on earth would the master allow this to happen? To which Amalei Rabbi Yochanan says as a response, Kol kach yesh b'yadcha? How could you possibly say such a thing? Ani shoneh, I have a braita that says, Hakotev shtar erusin l'shipchato. If a person himself betroths with a shtar erusin, right, a betrothal document, his own shipcha, okay, his non-Jewish slave woman, a maidservant, Rabbi Meir Omer Mekudeshet. Rabbi Meir says this is valid kiddushin because again, he must have redeemed her, otherwise he wouldn't be marrying her. But Chachamim Omrim Eina Mekudeshet. The rabbis say she's not betrothed. In other words, we're just assuming he's doing something wrong. He's doing something against the law. He's betrothing his slave woman. So if he himself betrothed the slave woman, that doesn't show that he's freeing her. Then how could him standing by and not even doing anything, but just watching this happening, how could that possibly be an indication that he's freeing his slave? So the answer, they're going to say, well, don't think it's the case like we saw before. It's not what Rebbe said, the Evet shenasat bat chorim b'fnei rabo yatsa l'cherut is not exactly the case. The case is not that he just stood there watching, in which case we can easily, we can say that doesn't make any sense in light of when he betrothed her himself. But it's when he was actually active in betrothing, he did the betrothal for the slave. If he does the betrothal for the slave, that's a clear indication that he's freeing him, just like, I want to see this Rav Shila says it in a different case, that if the master puts tefillin on the Eved, it's a clear indication he's freeing him. As opposed to, we're going to see later, as opposed to if the Eved does it himself and the master is standing. So now we have three distinctions, okay? It's a little bit unclear, and then in a second, the Gemara is going to say this is really not clear, so don't worry. But right now we have case number one. We had if the Eved just gets married and the master is standing there, that's not an indication of anything. The fact that he doesn't respond doesn't mean anything. That's what we thought it meant something, we now rejected that. It doesn't mean anything. On the other extreme, we have the master actually does the betrothal for the slave to a Jewish woman. That's a clear indication that he's freeing him. What's in the middle? The case where we have a machloket, but the rabbis do say this doesn't work. The case where he himself betroths a maidservant. Then we assume he's doing the wrong thing. So, right, he's just going against the law. We don't assume that he freed him. So that's what the question is going to be. I don't understand. When he betroths his slave to another woman, a Jewish woman, we're certain he's not doing anything wrong. He must have freed the slave. He wouldn't do it otherwise. But when it comes to his own betrothal, he's going to betroth a maidservant when it's forbidden to him? That doesn't make any sense. Why would someone do something that was totally wrong? He won't do something wrong for his slave, but he will do something wrong himself, which means that we're back to square one, because the rabbis say that basically if you betroth this maidservant, it's not an indication you're setting her free. So likewise, it shouldn't be setting your slave free if you betroth him to somebody else. because basically, why would you distinguish and make sure you're doing the right thing when you do it with your slave, but not for yourself? It makes no sense. So we're going to start again. We're going to have a different explanation. Now we now have to explain basically the bright. Okay, so at this point, we don't really understand anymore the first case. We have two possibilities. Okay, he definitely goes free. The question is, was he just standing by on the side, or did he actually actively do the kiddushin for the slave? Okay, so we don't know. But that, no matter how we explain that, it doesn't contradict this other source where he himself betroths the maidservant, because the question there is something totally different. It has nothing to do with our case. So here's our answer. Yitzchak says, what's the case in that brayta? He gives her a document. Now, we already learned that you need to get shiur to release your slave. You have to give them a document of emancipation. We also know that you can betroth a woman with a document. So what if in the same document, he uses the following language? Si'ibo v'hitkadshibo. Go out with this and be betrothed with this. So now Rabbi Meir Saval, yesh b'lashon hazeh lashon shiur. It doesn't say the word shiur, you are freed. It just says go out with this. So what does it mean go out with this? Does it, Rabbi Meir says, what do you mean go out? Go out with this and be betrothed to me. That means go out from being my slave and be betrothed to me through this, which is basically freedom, emancipation. Rabbanan Savre, this is not the normal language, and maybe it means something else. Go out and get betrothed, like go out and go to the store. Go out, maybe go out doesn't mean be freed from being a slave woman, and maybe he really is doing something forbidden, which is marrying his maidservant, which is not allowed to be done. And therefore, it's not an indication. But then this has absolutely nothing to do with our case, because it's not a matter of, it's just a matter of what's the language used, and that's the machloka between them. Is this language sufficient to be considered shiur? It's not. Our case was a case, can we assume that he already must have freed them? Otherwise, he wouldn't be doing this. In this case, he's trying to free her in this language, but the question is the language sufficient or not. Later today, we'll get to a bunch of issues about what language you use to free someone. It won't be exactly this, but it's obviously it has to be a certain language that makes it clear that it's freedom. So that's the debate here. It has nothing to do with anything, that we were discussing. Another halacha. Okay, we're going to have a whole bunch of rulings, and every time we're going to bring a ruling, we're going to bring some questions about it. So again, here we have a slave who does something that indicates he's Jewish. Okay, now remember, slaves are pseudo-Jewish. They're treated, they have the same laws as women have, okay, even though it's not to say women are like slaves, but they happen to have the same rules, which is that they're exempt from time-bound mitzvot, okay, perhaps for the same reason, perhaps for a different reason, right? Nobody really knows why women are exempt from time-bound mitzvah. We'll get more to that when we get to Kiddushin, when the main sugya comes up there about time-bound commandments. So a little bit of patience over a few months will be there. But anyway, the fact is the technical details are the same. They're exempt from time-bound mitzvah. Now, tefillin is a whole issue in and of itself about right? There's all these questions that came up in particularly Tosfot's time where women were clearly wanted to become part of doing mitzvot that they weren't allowed to do. It wasn't necessarily happening in other times. It wasn't necessarily happening everywhere. But in Ashkenaz, in France, particularly in the Middle Ages, there were women who wanted to do mitzvot. And they start, doing mitzvot, and it becomes this question, can they make a bracha? Lulav, sukkah, things like that. Tefillin comes up also, and there's all these sources that say one can wear tefillin, one can't wear tefillin. Whole debate nowadays about it again. So here it seems like you can't wear tefillin if you're not commanded to wear tefillin, right? That's what it sounds like, because if he's putting tefillin on his eved, who's exempt, seems like he thinks the eved is Jewish, right? Even though theoretically, maybe. So Tosfot addresses this issue somewhat and says, the issue is, he says at the end of Tosfot, it's more that it's an indicator because of societal norms. Since Avadim didn't do this, if he put it on his eved, it would be an indicator that he freed his slave. Not that it was forbidden for the slave to do it, like the marriage was an issue that was forbidden to the slave to marry a Jewish woman. The tefillin wasn't that it was forbidden, right? Of course, there are all these sources about, they talk about guf naki, you have to have a clean body, you have to be very cautious about tefillin, and that's why anyone who's not commanded really shouldn't do it. So anyway, there's a whole debate about this. This sugya is part of that whole debate. So in any case, let's stick with our daf so we get through it today. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi basically says, if the Eved puts on tefillin in front of the master and the master doesn't say anything, it's an indication that he's free, because it must be the owner freed him. Meitive, then we're going to bring a contradiction from a different Braita. Lavahimenu Rabbo, Oshaseo Rabbo Apitropos. Okay, there's two categories. There's two categories here. The first two are in one category. If I, let's say, own slaves and then I borrow money from them. Now that is something that usually you don't do in a slave owner relationship. Now again, right, you might have someone who works for you who you might do that with, okay, depending on the situation. But again, here we're talking about a different world. This wasn't our world that we live in. We don't have slaves. We don't, right? That's not, but in those days, right, there was a real hierarchy here. You would never really borrow money from your slave. Or you made your slave an apitropos. You said, you're in charge of all my money. That also wouldn't normally happen, not with the Canaanite slave. That wasn't what they generally had their Canaanite slaves do. Oh, now category number two is, or he did these two acts that were religious acts that were normally done by only full-fledged Jews. So either he put on tefillin in front of his rabbi, or again, rabbi doesn't mean rabbi, his master, or he read 3 psukim in shul, which is an aliyah, basically. An aliyah is a minimum of 3 psukim. He read an aliyah in shul, and his master didn't say anything. So all those cases, even though number one, you kind of broke down the hierarchy. Category number two, they were doing religious things that are reserved for Jews only. So any of these situations, though, this is not an indicator. So how do you resolve that how do you resolve what Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi said? Said exactly the same thing that appears in this Braita, who says he doesn't go free if he put on tefillin, and Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi says he does go free. So Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi is an Amora, he can't go against the Braita. I'm a Rabbi Bar of Sheila, and here's where we quoted him before is saying this. It's when the Adon put the tefillin. He didn't act. He didn't just stand there and not respond. He actually did an act where he went out and put the tefillin on the Eved. And so we changed what Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi said to a more active way of showing I freed my slave. He asked Rav Dimi Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Okay, remember that Rav Dimi says this. We're going to come back to this later in the day. Rav Dimi quotes Rabbi Yochanan. Rav Dimi was one of the people, the Nechute. They went from Israel to Babylonia, and they brought the Torah of Israel to Babylonia. We're going to have basically Rav Dimi's version of what Rabbi Yochanan said. We're going to have a question. Rabbi Ami, Rabbi Asi, you're going to go against him and say that's not what Rabbi Yochanan said. There can't be. And then someone else is going to bring a different tradition about what Rabbi Yochanan actually said. So the Gemara right now is going to seemingly prefer the second version. But Ki'ata Rav Dimi Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Misha Amar b'shat mitato, plonit shivchati al yishtabdu balachar moti. He had a very dedicated maidservant, and when he was ready to die, he said, listen, I don't want you to make her work after my death. Okay, now, it's a very unclear language, right? I don't want you to make her work, lo al yishtabdu bi, okay? But don't make her work could mean one of two things. It could mean let her sit on the couch with her feet up all day. Okay, but she's still owned by me, which means if she has children, they're slaves. Or it could mean as soon as I die, she's a free woman. Okay, she's not going to work anymore. She's not part of my household anymore, which means that, well, number one, it means that she's not owned anymore by him. So therefore, any children she has are not going to be his. Number two, it means that, well, he didn't give her a get shiur yet. So she can't marry until somebody gives her a get shiur. The problem is he won't be around anymore. So what happens? We force the children, once he dies, to release her. So obviously Rav Dimi thinks that, even in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, that even though he just said al yishtabdu bi, that means she's freed, but she's not fully freed. She's freed in terms of the financial issue, but she's not freed in terms of the Jewish issue. She's still not permitted yet to marry until she has the get shiur in hand, which we saw previously, right? That there's hamafkir avdo, remember someone who makes his slave ownerless, which is basically what he did, still needs a get shiur, right? There was a whole debate about Rav and Shmuel about this, but we seem to go with Rav that she needs a get shiur in order to permit her. There's two issues. There's who owns her financially, and then there's when does she become a Jew, right? And to do that, she needs to have a get shiur. So now, Amru lefanav Rabbi Ami Rabbi Asi. Rebbe, don't you think that wouldn't you agree with us that her sons are still slaves? Because there was no real shiur here. He didn't make her ownerless. He just said, have her sit on the couch with her feet up, don't make her work anymore. Doesn't mean she's not owned by him. So they totally disagree with him. Now here comes Rav Shmuel bar Yehuda. When he came, he brought a different tradition of Rabbi Yochanan. Misha amal b'shat mitato, ploni shepchati korat ruach hastali, yasela korat ruach. Now, someone who says on his deathbed, while I was alive, this woman made me feel good, right? She basically helped me to get through. I want you to do what makes her feel good. Okay, now at this point, basically, he's passing her on to the children. And the children now are commanded by the father to do whatever she wants. So if she wants her freedom, she says, well, what made me feel good is to be free. They can then insist that the Yorshim do exactly what the father said. My taima mitzvah l'kayim divrei hamit. Because here, it was very clear what he wanted. Because what he wanted was whatever she wants. And if whatever she wants is freedom, then the children were commanded basically to free her. And then they can actually free her. But the language of ayishta beba, that wasn't a very clear language. And that the Gemara seems to go against, that we don't really seem to hold like Rav Dimi. Although, like I said, we're going to get back to him. So now we have a statement of Amemar, and we're going to have two different versions of what Amemar said. Hamar Amemar. Hamafkir avdo. Now, if you remember, I just said this, but I'll say it again. Hamafkir avdo. Shmuel says the Eved is free. You make your slave ownerless. Say, I don't own you anymore. Slave is free. You don't even need to get shiur. They can marry you right away. Rav said, Mafkir avdo still needs to get shiur. You've released of the financial, but you still need to release the isur. Comes a Meimar and he says, Oto Eved elo takana. You freed your slave. What's the problem now? They're not owned by you. If they're not owned by you and you have no financial connection to them anymore, then how on earth can you release them from, how can you give them a get shiur? It's too late. If you release your slave with a get shiur, that's the normal way to do it. So you've done everything all at once. But if you say, I don't want to be your owner anymore, and you give up ownership rights, you can't possibly write them a get shiur when they're not owned by you. So now that Eved is stuck. So when Amemar says this, the Gemara says, right, so now he explains first, my time, but what's the reason? Gufe lo kanele. The person is not owned anymore by you. Isuru di'ika gabe, all that's left is they're forbidden to marry a Jewish woman. And Isur lo mase machnele, and he can't pass him that because he no longer owns him, the owner. So you're stuck. So Amalei Rav Ashi Amemar, how could you possibly say this? V'hamar ula, didn't we learn this? Amar Rabbi Yochanan, v'Rav Chia bar Av and Amar Rav, we had this in the name of Rabbi Yochanan and in the name of Rav, passed down. Echad ze v'echad ze yatsa l'chirut, v'tzarich yat shichur. Whether you're makdish your Eved, you sanctify the Eved, or whether you're mafkir, you make the slave ownerless. Both Rav and Rabbi Yochanan said, right, and forget about Shmuel, who said you don't need anything. But both of them said, yatsa l'chirut, they go free, but you need to give them a get shichur. So it sounds like the way we understood it certainly was, and of course you can give them a get shichur. To which Amemar answers, in this version anyway, Amarle tzarich ve'en lo takana. We misread that entirely according to Amemar. Tzarich means you need to get shichur, the Eved, but no one is there to give it to him because nobody owns him anymore. So there's no solution. And this person is stuck. Okay, they can't get married. They're stuck. They can't marry a slave because they're not really a slave, and they can't marry a Jew because they're not really a Jew. So according to Amemar, this person is stuck. But it's a very hard situation to, again, we always want to avoid that. In fact, there's a famous machloket Beit Shammai Beit Hillel, which we're going to get to today. We're not going to read it inside, but they are going to relate to that case, where there's a chetzio eved, chetzio ben holim. Okay, someone who one master released and the other one didn't. He was owned by two masters. So the eved is stuck. Can't marry a free woman, can't marry a slave. So the Beit Shammai says you have to free. And Beit Hillel says, the guy's stuck. And the Beit Shammai says, what, you're going to keep this person stuck? It's unfair. And Beit Hillel agrees with Beit Shammai in the end. And they say you have to free the slave. Okay, basically they force the other master to free the slave so the slave can marry a Jewish woman. So here it seems hard that Amemar is basically saying this person is stuck in this situation. There's nothing you could do. Second version of Amemar is the following. Amar Ikad Amre. Some people say Amar Amemar, that Amemar said, Hamafkir avdo vamet, oto ha'eved ein lo takana. Amemar says a little bit different. Mafkir avdo, if you made your slave ownerless and then you died, then the slave has no takana. If you made your slave ownerless, you can actually give them the get shiur. But what's the problem? Normally, your slaves you pass on inheritance to your children. Why do you pass them on inheritance? Because they're part of your property. So along with your money that you pass on your slaves. If you made your slave ownerless, you can't pass on the isur element of it to your children. You can pass on the monetary element, but the monetary element is gone. The slave is owned by you. So that's what they're going to say right now. My time, agufa lo kanele. The body of the slave is no longer owned by you. Isur dabe. It's all that's left is this isur that you have to release. You have to basically say, okay, you're released from slavery, and then they can marry a Jewish woman. But isur libere lo morit, you can't pass that on to your children. You can only pass on monetary. Since there's no monetary anymore, well, you can't do that. So this makes a little more sense. At least it's limiting the case, first of all, to people who are going to be stuck in situations where they can't get married. And it makes a lot of sense that you can't pass that on to your children. So Amarle Rav Ashi Lameimar. So Rav Ashi comes to Meimar and says, but wait, Haki ata Rav Dimi, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Now let's go back to Rav Dimi. Okay, let's try to remember. What did Rav Dimi say? Go back. Someone who said, Bishami Tato, Ploni Chukadi, Ayish Dabdu Valachar Moti, which basically means as soon as I'm dead, the way Rav Ashi understood, the way Rav Dimi understood it is, as soon as I die, she's free. And then what do? We force the Yorshim to write her a get shiur. Now, if she's free and they don't own her financially, then how could they possibly write her a get shiur? So basically, Rav Ashi says to Ameimar, based on Rav Dimi, the children can write a get shiur. So you're wrong about what you said. So what does he answer? Obviously, Rav Dimi ta'utehi. Rav Dimi was just a mistake, right? That's what we saw. But comes Rav Ashi and says to him, what are you talking about? What was the mistake of Rav Dimi? This wasn't the mistake of Rav Dimi. The mistake wasn't that you can't pass on this to your children. What was the mistake? The problem with Rav Dimi was the language he used. He said, don't make her work, which could have meant put her feet up on the couch and not do anything. But it didn't mean I don't own her. That was the problem. But if he had said, I'm freeing you, then what would have happened? It sounds like Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Yassi would have agreed that we force the heirs. Now, according to what you're saying, Amemar, we can't force the heirs. So basically, he questions him based on Rav Dimi. However, we know the answer already, or maybe you haven't thought of this, but Amarle, remember, there were two versions of what Rabbi Yochanan said. So he just simply says, I don't hold by Rav Dimi. I hold by the other version of what Rabbi Yochanan said, which was, let's go back and remind ourselves, then Yasela Kor Ruach, and we can force the Yorshim to do Korat Ruach. But that was something totally different. That's not the same thing here, because then she was owned by them, and and then in that case she was still owned by them, and that's why they could do it. Whereas Ameimar says, but if she wasn't owned by them anymore, there's no way we could force them. And don't question me from Rav Dimi because we don't hold that. Okay, we're going to come back to Rav Dimi in the next story as well. It's going to be the same thing. What about Rav Dimi? And they're going to say, oh, Rav Dimi was a mistake. So now we have two stories. How diskarta da'avde? The story, the reality of the story is quite difficult to fathom that it really happened like the way they say. But anyway, we'll go through the story and we'll explain. There was a diskarta of avadim. Diskarta, they say, is like a city. There was a city or a whole group of people that lived together that were Gentile slaves. They were bought by Jews. Okay, and then the Jews had this city or something of slaves, Gentile slaves. They sold all of them to a group of Gentiles. So now remember what happens. You sell your slaves, they go free. Okay, but Kalumar Vata Batra, all their Gentile owners died. This is why it's hard to imagine this. The reality, there was a whole group, the entire group of slaves were sold to a group of Gentiles. All the Gentiles died. They didn't have children also. So nobody inherited them. So or took over them. So now they had these slaves that were kind of free. But what was the problem? They never got a get shiur. So if you free your slave, you have to give him a get shiur in order to permit him to marry a Jew. While they were in the authority of the Gentiles, they really needed, it was hard for them to be Jews anyway. They were slaves of Gentile owners. So Atu the Kamei de Ravina. So they came before Ravina. Kamar Lahu, he said to them as they wanted to marry Jewish women now. Zilu ahad Rabbanit Marvata de Kamai. Go back Now, here's another unrealistic part of the story. Go back to the sons of your original owners, the Jewish owners. Apparently, all the Jewish owners had died by then also. So all that was left were the sons of the owners. And they'll write you a get shiur. And what's the problem? You hold by a meimar that they weren't owned by the sons because the sons didn't inherit because the fathers had already sold them. Then how could the sons possibly write a get shiur? So Amrle Rabbanan Rabina Amar Amemar, but didn't Amemar say, even in the second Amemar, he says this, right? Amafkir Abdov Vamet, Otoa Eved Lo Takana. And even if you don't accept the first reading of Amemar, you're going to have, did I say Rav Dimi before? Sorry, we're going to get to Rav Dimi, but Amemar, right? Amemar second, even the second reading was, right? The first reading was even the first owner can't give him the get shiur. But the second reading was someone makes their slave ownerless, which is what they did. They sold him. It's all one and the same, right? They sold him saying, we're not owners. And now you want their sons to give the get shiur? They can't do that. So Amar Lahu, Ana Rav Dimi Sfira. He says, oh, who holds by Amemar? I hold by Rav Dimi. What did Rav Dimi say? Okay, we have to keep remembering. If you say Al Yishtabdu Balachar Moti, basically, according to Rav Dimi, that was freeing her, and then we forced the sons to, right? That goes against Amemar. So Amruleh, they said to Rabina, to Rav Dimi Ta'utehi. What are you talking about? Rav Dimi was all a mistake. But Rabina was very smart. He says, no. Amar Lahu Mai Ta'uta. What was his mistake? Dilo Amar B'lashon Shichur. Rav Dimi said was wrong. Why was Rav Dimi wrong? Because he said Al Yishtabduba. He didn't say she's free, right? Now, our case is equivalent to them saying she's free because they sold her, or they sold him, the slaves, them. They sold these men, these slaves. So once they sold them, they were no longer owned by them. And Rav Dimi, even though those who disagree with Rav Dimi, their disagreement with Rav Dimi was because he said Al Yishtabduba, which could have meant put your feet up on the couch and don't work. Didn't necessarily mean free her. But if Rav Dimi had brought a case where he said free her, right, she'll be free the second I die, they would have forced the children and everyone would agree with them. That's what Rabina is claiming. So they say, right, it will work. And then they say, Rabina. They actually paskin like Rabina. So even though Rav Dimi is rejected because of the Al Yishtabdu. But if he really said she's free and then he dies, the children could actually be forced to give her a get shiur. They really could give her a get shiur. In the end, we say that, and that goes against Amemar, basically. So we have a machloket Amemar and Rabina about what happens if someone is mafkir their eved or sells their eved, and then somehow the eved gets back to them, right? And theoretically, they are the ones who can free the slave. Can they do it or not? Can the sons do it? So Rabina says yes, and we actually hold that way, which again shows that they wanted to minimize Amemar, who basically left the slave without any sort of resolution. They paskin more in a lenient manner that we can't find a resolution to the situation. Another situation. How of the debate trade? There was somebody owned by two owners. Now we're going to get to the chetzi eved, chetzi ben chorim, the half. So one of them said, I'm freeing the slave, and frees his half of the slave. Now we have a person who's half slave, half not slave. So what do we normally do? What Beit Hillel eventually agrees to Beit Shammai, which is we force the other master to free the slave. But this person does not want to free his slave. So what does he do? He gets smart. He says, he says to himself, Amar Idach, the other owner, Hashta Shame Rabbanan, and the rabbis are going to hear about this, that there's a half slave, half free man on the loose. And they're going to take him away from me. They're going to make me sell him. I don't want to sell my slave. What will I do? I'll sell it to my minor son. Okay, this is, I know, people often sell their property, right? Put their property in their children's name or something to avoid taxes or things like that. So this guy says, I'm going to give it to my younger son. If I give it to my younger son, what will happen? Well, the rabbis can't come, the Beit Din can't force the son to do anything because he's a minor. They don't do any forcing on minors. So once the eved is in the property of my minor son, I'll resolve the problem. They can't come and force him, and he'll remain my slave. Shachar Rav Yosef Berei de Rabba l'kamei de Rav Papa. So the rabbis obviously got wind of this. Rav Yosef, the son of Rabba, goes to Rav Papa and says, what do I do? Rav Papa answers him, Shalach le, ka'asher asa ken ya'aseh lo, gumulo yashiv lo b'rosho. He says, what this guy did to us, we'll do to him. In other words, he was tricky with us, we'll be tricky with him. Okay, what are we going to do? We know the kids like money. You dangle money in front of a child, he'll want the money. Okay, he has a slave, but he might want money more than the slave, right? So, we can appoint as the court. We have the rights to appoint an apitropos for this child. So we're going to appoint a court-appointed apitropos, turning out to Amud Bed. And he's going to tell the son. Now, the son right here, and some of the Mepharshim say, the kid's screaming, I won't get rid of the slave, because that's what his father's telling him to say. But then they dangle some money, and they say, if you give us the slave, you give him his freedom, we'll pay you money. Okay? He'll buy his way out. You won't get the money today, but kind of dangle money in front of his face to say, but there's money in this for you. So the kid will see the money, be attracted to the money. He'll agree to have the apitropos write a get shiur in his name that basically says the slave owes you money. Okay, there's a big debate, Rashi and Tosfot, I'm not going to get into this, but it's an interesting debate about who's doing the sale here. Is it the apitropos in the end is doing the freeing, or is it the child? And we're talking about a child who's over the age where they can already do masal matan, but then there's a problem because it's only the Rabbanan. Anyway, there's a whole big debate about how exactly, technically speaking, this works. But the idea basically is that they found some subterfuge way to basically get the child to agree. As soon as the child agrees, then the apitropos can't do something against the will of the child. But the apitropos can act with the will of the child. If the child says, this is what I want, and the child's old enough, remember we talked about this age, like between 6 and 8 is an age where they can do business dealings. They understand the concept, right? Like when kids, when in my day it was flipping baseball cards and stuff, that when you lose your baseball cards, you lose them. You don't get them back. Once you understand that concept, you can actually engage in some business deals, and there's some sort of validity to it. So in this case, since it's the apitropos, maybe he does the action, but the child agrees, or perhaps we just say that the child's action is actually valid, and then they basically were able to get this slave to be freed. So you again see how the rabbis went so far as to, if you thought before in the previous city, it's hard to understand this concept of slaves, but here they had compassion especially for these slaves who were half free, half not, and can't marry, particularly in the marriage area. They wanted to enable them not to be stuck in a situation where they can't marry anybody. Tanu Rabbanit. Now we're going to talk about languages of a get shiur. Ha'omer, someone who says, and in a minute we're going to see, and I'll just tell you already, Rabbi Yochanan is going to say this is we're all talking about shtar, written. Okay, this isn't saying. Saying means you say in the document. Okay, if you say, meaning if you write in your document, asiti ploni abdi ben cholim, I made this so and so my eved is a free person. Asoy ben cholim, he is made a free person. Harehu ben cholim, behold, he is a free person. Harehu ben cholim, this all works. Esenu ben cholim, but if you write in the document, I will make him a free person. Rebbe Omer kana, chachamim omrim lo kana. Okay, Rebbe says that's fine, because what do you mean? You're writing in the document, I will make him a free person, which means as soon as you finish writing the document and sign it, you freed him. Chachamim said, no, you could be saying at some future point, I will make him a free person. So that doesn't work. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, as I said before, v'kulam b'shtar. I told you this in advance, but that Rabbi Yochanan says this is all written. We're talking about when you write this in your shtar, and not just if you say it. Because again, we learned already, you need a document. Tanu Rabbanan, similar situation, the exact same language, but talking about selling a field. If you say, I gave this particular field to so-and-so, nituna leploni, it was given to so-and-so. Harehu shelo, if you say, behold, it is his. All of those work to say harehu shelo. This works to say, if a person has a document with those words in it, they could say this property is mine. But etnena leploni, if you come up to court and say, listen, this guy gave me a document and it says, I will give the field to so-and-so. Again, Rabbi Meir Omer konet, chachamim kanat, chachamim omrim lo kanat. There's a debate about whether this is actually acquired by him or not, because it could be, I will give it to you means, I'll sell it to you in a year from now, and maybe you didn't do that. And again, Amar Rabbi Yochanan b'kulam b'shtar. Tanu Rabbanan. Now we have another interesting situation here. Ha'omer asiti ploni abdi ben cholim. If you say, I made so-and-so my eved, a free person, you come to court and you testify, I made him free. And the slave says, no, you didn't free me. This is an interesting situation. Normally you would think the argument would be the opposite. Here the owner's saying I freed him. The slave is saying, you didn't free me. Chayshinan, we're concerned, Shema zikalo al yedei achim. maybe the slave doesn't know he was free, because theoretically, what did we learn? Zachin la'adam shelo b'fanav. I can do something good for someone not in their presence. And freeing a slave, we learned already, is good for the slave. So therefore, it could be that when I say I did it, maybe the slave just doesn't know. And that's why, now here it gets tricky. That's why what? Look at the language. Chayshina, we are concerned that maybe I freed him using another person. I gave you the rights to acquire his freedom for him, and he actually doesn't know. So what does this mean? Does this mean therefore he's free? Therefore we believe me as opposed to the slave? Or some people, there's a debate. Some people say, yes, we believe me and not the slave. Also, one of the other reasons why I'm believed is because if I really wanted to, I could, if let's say I hadn't freed him, I could free him right now. I could just write a document, you are freed, and he'd be free. So since I could do that so simply, we therefore believe me. This is like we learned about Eid Echad Ne'eman B'Yisurin in the beginning of the Masechet. One witness is to believe that I shechted an animal, because now, even though I don't normally shecht it, I don't know how to, but theoretically, I could shecht it myself, or I could find someone to slaughter it. It's pretty easy. So, or something like that. Or maybe an easier example is I took the Trumot Hamas, or I took the tithes. If I didn't do it, I could do it right now. It's very simple. But some people say no. Choshishin is the language of Safek. We're concerned that maybe, on the other hand, we also believe the slave. So then we have a case of a doubt, which is a totally different scenario, because we have a case of a doubt, things remain status quo, and he actually remains a slave, as opposed to, right, and then he's like also in a case of doubt, and he's kind of stuck, maybe slave, maybe free. So that's a debate about how to read this Gemara, and the same debate is going to be in the next line. Katafti v'natati lo. If I say, I wrote the document and I gave it to him, now you can't say, maybe I gave it to someone else. I say, I gave it to the slave. V'hu omer lo katavli v'lo natani, and the slave says, you didn't write any document and you didn't give it to me. Hoda'at baldin k'mei edim dami. So when someone admits to something, it's more strong, or it's as if it's 100 witnesses. Okay, so what does this mean? Again, you have two hoda'ot baldin. You have they're both baldin, right? Because one owns the other and one wants to, right, own himself. Like, is he a slave? Not. So we have two people who are admitting to things that are actually not in their best interest, neither of them. So is it again 50-50, Safek, we don't know, in which case, again, the slave remains a slave? Or do we say in this case, the Hoda'at Baldin is the slave himself? He's the one who's believed. Now, one of the logical answers, I thought this was very relevant. We talk about things when they use all these ideas about trying to get to halacha through the way the human psyche works, the way human behavior. It's very interesting. So I thought this was a really interesting one. If I freed my slave and I claim I freed the slave and I gave it to you, and the slave says you didn't, okay? Think about when you owe someone money. Who remembers that you owe money? You remember that you owe them the money, right? But let's say it like this. If you have a whole bunch of people you borrowed money from, you might not remember who you gave the money back to, right? But the person who's waiting to get his money back, he'll probably remember that you haven't paid him back, although one could argue that one the other way. So maybe that's not a good example. But what they say is this. They say the following. The master intended to free the slave, clearly, because that's what he said. It could be that he thought he actually did it. Like, how many times do you say to someone, I wrote you a message about this, and then they say, no, you didn't. And then you go and you check your phone, and it turns out you had it. You just had planned to write it, and you thought that you did it, but you really didn't. So when you're planning something, you think about it a lot, it's in your head, and then to the extent that sometimes you actually believe that you did it. Whereas the slave, it was not planning on getting his freedom from you. He didn't know it was coming. He has no control over it. So he would remember if it happened, because if it didn't happen, he would know it didn't happen. So therefore, there's more likely that the slave, that it's not that you're trying to lie, it's just that you believe as the master that you actually did it and you really didn't. The slave says, I didn't get anything. Maybe the slaves actually believe more than you. So there's interesting logic to say, one or the other, but like I said, both these cases, what the Gemara is saying is a source of debate among the Rishonim. Are they saying it's clear we believe the Adon in the first and the Eved in the second, or are both cases really left as a doubt? And they're just saying, that might be the case, but it might be the opposite. Okay, keep going on. Mi ochel pirot. Well, now we have this debate. Who gets, like, if it's, I skipped. We have the exact same thing in the case of land. Again, I sold you the field. You say I did sell you the field. Again, we're worried. Maybe I sold you the field and gave it to someone else to acquire it on your behalf. right? I say, I wrote the document and I gave it to you. And you say, no, you didn't. Again, we don't know what this means, but the same exact thing, right? You admit it, it's like 100 witnesses. Are we talking about just the buyer, or are we talking about both sides? So now the question is, who eats the payroll? In other words, in the field, we have a question of who gets the proceeds of the field then. Rav Chisda Amar noten ochel perot. The one who gave the field gets, in other words, who claims he sold it, gets to still eat the fruits. Rabba Amar mishalshin et hapirot. Rabba says we give it to a third party and we hold it till we can figure out what the answer is, what the truth is. Velo pligi. Haba abba, haba bura. But the truth is, there's really no debate here. One is if it's the father, one if it's the son. Okay, the father and the son of who? Of the buyer. If it's the buyer himself and he says, no, you didn't sell it to me, then the original owner gets to continue eating the proceeds. We believe the second guy. If it's his son saying, you didn't give it to my father, then we don't really know because he's speaking in place of his father. How does he really know what happened? And in that case, we leave it in a third party's hands. New Mishnah. This is a very complicated Mishnah. We're not going to fully understand it today. We're going to have the Gemara doesn't fully understand it and doesn't know who's talking and what's what. So we're going to start with our first explanation of the Mishnah today. We'll see more explanation tomorrow. Okay. There's two different interpretations of what an apotiki are. They're both kind of similar, but with a big important difference. Apotiki is when you basically say, I took out a loan and I say, instead of paying you back with money, I'm going to pay you with my slave. So when time for the loan comes up, you're going to take this slave. So the slave has a title on him, owed to the Malva. That's one interpretation. Another is very similar, but it's I say to you, in the event that I don't pay you the money, you can take it from this slave. You can collect the slave. So the slave is lean to you either which way. It's just one is more lean to you than the other because you're definitely taking from the slave as opposed to the other case where you might take from the slave. But either way, you kind of know this slave is designated to you as payment for my loan. Then shichurero, then I free the slave. So the slave is no longer a slave. And now you don't really have the slave to collect. Shurat hadin ena eved chayav klum. According to the basic letter of the law, the eved doesn't know anything. And that is the eved's a free person. The fact that I put the eved as lien to your loan, and then I freed him. Well, now he's nothing, right? He's not anything. But mipnei tikun haolam, kofinit rabo, we force. Now we're not sure who we force, me or you. We don't know yet. Ve'oseo to ben cholim, for tikkun olam purposes, we force someone to free him. Ve'kotev shtar al damav, and he gets a document that he has to pay his way out. In other words, now the slave has to pay his way out, even though he was freed by one master. He now has to pay the value of himself to whoever right now gave him a get shifur. No, you don't have to write a shtar al damav, but you do have to free. So let's go to the Gemara and try to understand. Who freed him in the first place? Okay, Amarav, Rabo Rishon. Okay, we're talking about the way we explained it. I freed the slave in the first place. Okay, even though I promised him to you, I then decided I was freeing the slave. Shurat hadin ein eved chayav klum l'rabo sheni. The letter of the law is that eved doesn't know anything to you. Why? Kedarava. We've learned this a bunch of times already. The Amarava hekdesh chametz v'shipur mafki'im midei shiabut. If you sanctify something to the temple that was liened to someone's loan, or you had chametz, which Pesach came and made it forbidden to benefit from, or you freed a slave, that all removes the lien entirely. That's what Rava holds. But mipnei tikun olam shema yimtze'ena b'shuk v'yomar lo avdiata. But I'll just continue a little bit so we finish this slide. We're worried that since you, as the malva, the lender, the creditor, you know that this slave was yours. Now you might not know I freed him. So if you see him running around in the shuk, you might say, "Hey, he's my slave." Now that will be a big problem for the slave because the slave, right, is free. They're a free regular Jew right now walking around, and then they get told in the shuk, "You're a slave." So kofinit rabo sheni v'oseo to ben cholim b'kotev eved shtar al dama. So we basically, for the slave's best interest, but the slave has to end up paying for this. We basically force you, even though you never really owned the slave, but it seems like you somewhat did because he was an apotiki to the loan. You have to free that slave so that you know that the slave is freed, but the slave has to pay you the money for it because why should you lose out? So we end up for a tikkun olam, we make basically the slave pay his way out, even though he was really free. Okay, it seems a little unfair to the slave, but it's also to protect the slave. So there's those two sides to it. Okay, quick review of the daf. We're not going to go through all the cases, but we saw a whole bunch of what we had, and you can look at the study guide. It'll help you see. We have 4 laws. Okay, 2 are like there's one that's a debate who said what, and then we had 2 versions of the third and the fourth both came in 2 different versions of all these different laws about freeing slaves. A language that a master might say that makes it clear that the slave is freed, or an action that the master might do to make it clear the slave is freed. Are they freed? Each time we kind of bring a question. Oh, that doesn't make sense in light of this, and then they had to explain it. We had different versions, and then we had some stories that tried to show the implementation of these laws. And then we moved to language that you use in a get shiur, what language works, what doesn't. What if we have a debate, whether I say I freed you and you say you didn't? How does that work? And then we got to this last thing about the apotiki and a complicated situation where we're going to end up, if you free the apotiki slave, what happens to the slave after that? What's the concern, right? So again, we have Rava's explanation. We're going to see another different explanation of it tomorrow. Okay, wishing everybody a Shavua Tov and a good day.